Look at that. In 1969, Dodge built a race car with a wing so tall a grown man could walk under it without ducking. NASCAR wasn't sure it was legal. Chrysler wasn't sure it was fast enough. They were both wrong on the first count, and Chrysler was very wrong on the second. This is the story of the most audacious piece of aerodynamic engineering ever bolted onto an American stock car, and the one season it was allowed to exist. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the radical engineering of the muscle car era and how a few rebels in Detroit changed racing forever. If you're someone who loves the raw history of American speed and the technical secrets behind legendary machines, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. To understand what the Dodge Daytona was, you need to understand what NASCAR superspeedway racing looked like in the late 1960s. It wasn't the polished, heavily regulated sport you see today. It was a war between manufacturers, between engineers, between accountants who kept writing checks because the other side kept writing checks. Ford and Chrysler had been throwing money at the problem of going fast in a circle for years. And it showed in the cars, in the results, in the growing gap between the superspeedway specialists and everyone else. The superspeedways, Daytona International Speedway, Talladega Superspeedway, the big tracks were a different animal from short track. At 2.5 miles around, banked at steep angles, they rewarded one thing above everything else: pure top-end speed. Whoever had the fastest car on the straight didn't just win. They lapped people. They embarrassed people. They put the competition's engineers on the phone with their bosses explaining what went wrong. Here's the thing, Ford had figured this out early. Their Torino Talladega, named directly after the track it was built to dominate, was a purpose-built aerodynamic weapon. Flush front end, extended nose, low hood line. Ford's engineers had done the math. Drag was the enemy. Reduce drag, go faster. Simple in principle, expensive in execution. They also had the Mercury spoiler running the same basic concept. Two Aero weapons, same manufacturer, different nameplates. Chrysler was in trouble. Their standard Dodge Charger looked great on the showroom floor. On the track at Daytona or Talladega, it was a brick. Look, the production body had a recessed rear window that created a massive low-pressure zone directly behind the cabin. Air would get in, swirl around, and pull back on the car like an invisible hand. The grille was open and square, catching air instead of parting it. The hood sat high. Everything about the car that made it look aggressive on the street, made it slower at 200 miles per hour on a superspeedway. They tried fixing it incrementally. The Charger 500, the name referred to the 500 minimum production units required to homologate a body style for NASCAR, attempted to address the worst aerodynamic problems. Flush grille, tunneled-in rear window. It helped, but not enough. The Charger 500 debuted in the 1969 Daytona 500. Leroy Yarborough won in a Ford Torino. Cale Yarborough won races. Ford won races. Chrysler's engineers were watching Ford's cars gap them on the long straights by 2-3 car lengths. Against aerodynamically superior machinery, raw horsepower only goes so far. You can tune the engine all you want. If the body is fighting you at speed, you're running uphill. Chrysler needed a different answer. They stopped asking how to fix what they had and started asking the right question. What does the perfect superspeedway car actually look like? Not the best Charger, the best superspeedway car, whatever it takes. They were about to find out. The man Chrysler handed this problem to was Larry Rathgeb, head of motorsports research. An engineer, not a stylist, not a marketing person, not an executive who liked racing. An engineer with a specific brief. Beat Ford on the superspeedways. Figure out what it takes. Do it. Rathgeb and his team went to the wind tunnel, not with a finished car, with clay models, small scale, testing shapes, finding out what the air actually wanted to do and how to make it cooperate instead of fight. What they found wasn't complicated in principle, but it was complicated in execution. The problem with the standard Charger wasn't one thing, it was everything. The front end was pushing a wall of air. The middle section was generating lift. The car actually wanted to rise off the track at high speed, which is problematic when you're entering a banked corner at 180 miles per hour, and the rear end was a turbulent disaster, creating drag that scrubbed off speed continuously and unpredictably. Fixing the front was relatively straightforward. Extend the nose, point it, let the air split around the car instead of slamming into a flat face. They came up with a pointed nose cone that extended roughly 18 inches beyond the standard Charger's front end. Flush, smooth, efficient. It required flip-up headlights, pop-up units that stayed closed at race speeds to maintain the clean profile, small detail, worth doing. Fixing the rear was the problem. Any aerodynamicist will tell you that the rear of a car is where things get complicated. The air that's been smoothly guided over the roof and sides has to go somewhere when it reaches the back of the car. If it separates badly, you get a massive low-pressure zone behind the vehicle. That zone pulls back on everything. It is effectively like driving with a parachute partially deployed. Now, you might be thinking, why not just add a bigger engine? But here's what most people don't realize. At 200 miles per hour, you need 4 times the horsepower to overcome double the drag. It's a losing game of physics. The solution at the time was a spoiler, a lip at the rear of the trunk that catches air and deflects it downward, creating downforce and managing the separation. Every manufacturer was using small spoilers. They helped. But there was a ceiling on how much a small trunk-mounted spoiler could do, and Chrysler was approaching that ceiling without getting close to Ford's speed numbers. Rathgeb's team looked at the problem and concluded that a small spoiler wasn't going to close the gap. They needed something larger, significantly larger. The question wasn't whether to go bigger. The question was how much bigger was enough. The wind tunnel was about to give them an answer that surprised everyone, including the people running the test. This is where it gets really interesting. The secret physics of the 23-inch tower. Look, the wing started as a practical engineering decision and became the most recognizable thing on any race car in 1969. To really grasp why it looked the way it did, we have to talk about the physics of air. Here's the thing. A spoiler mounted at the trunk lip has a fundamental limitation beyond just size. It's too close to the body of the car. Think of it like trying to fly a kite right behind a moving truck. The air is tumbling, swirling, and generally a mess. In racing terms, we call that dirty air. You're trying to generate downforce using air that's already been chewed up by the roofline and the rear window. It works, sure, but there's a hard ceiling on how effective it can be. Now, you might be thinking, why not just make the spoiler wider or angled steeper? Well, that's where most people get it wrong. If you just make a standard spoiler bigger, you create massive amounts of drag, basically a giant parachute on your back end. This is where it gets really interesting. Larry Rathgeb's team realized that if they moved the wing higher, into the clean air flowing over the roof, they could get way more downforce with way less drag. They were looking for air that hadn't been disturbed by the car's cabin yet. Imagine sticking your hand out of a car window at 60 miles per hour. If you hold it right against the side of the door, the wind feels buffeted and weak. Move it just 6 inches out into the stream, and the force nearly rips your arm back. That's the difference between dirty and clean air. The wind tunnel tests gave them a specific number, 23 inches. That was the magic height. At 23 inches above the trunk deck, the horizontal stabilizer was sitting in air that was almost as smooth as the air hitting the front of the car. But here's what most people don't realize. There's a persistent myth that the wing was only that tall so the trunk could open. You'll hear this at every car show in America. Oh, they just wanted to make sure the lid cleared the wing. Look, while it's true that the height allowed the trunk to open, that was a secondary convenience, not the primary engineering goal. If the aerodynamics had called for a 10-inch wing, they would have just made the trunk lid smaller or designed a different hinge. In racing, you don't compromise 200 miles per hour stability just so the driver can get to his spare tire easier. The height was about performance, period. The wing wasn't just a flat board either. It was a sophisticated airfoil, shaped like an upside-down airplane wing. Instead of lifting the car into the sky, it used that clean air to shove the rear tires into the pavement with hundreds of pounds of force. To support that kind of pressure at 200 miles per hour, they couldn't just bolt it to the flimsy sheet metal of the trunk. They had to mount it on two massive vertical aluminum fins that were anchored directly to the structural quarters of the car. These fins acted like the feathers on an Aero, providing lateral stability. If the car started to slide sideways at high speed, those fins would catch the air and help, weather vane, the car back into a straight line. It made the Daytona feel like it was running on rails. Charlie Glotzbach was one of the first drivers to really lean on this thing at the Chrysler Proving Ground. Now, Glotzbach wasn't exactly a man of many words, but he was a super speedway specialist. A guy who felt more at home at 170 miles per hour than he did in a school zone. His job was to find out if the wind tunnel was lying to them. He took the prototype out, and within a few laps, he realized this wasn't just a slightly better Charger. It was a different species. The car was so planted and settled that he could take lines through the corners that would have sent a standard Charger into the wall. When he came back into the pits, his report was simple. The car didn't fight him. At speeds where most cars were wandering and light, the Daytona was locked in. The world finally got to see this winged warrior in action in September of 1969 at the brand-new Talladega Superspeedway. Now you have to understand Talladega was, and still is, a monster. It's 2.66 miles of high-bank terror. It was bigger, steeper, and faster than anything NASCAR had ever seen. It was the perfect stage for the Daytona. During qualifying, Glotzbach went out and absolutely shattered the status quo. He put the Daytona on the pole at 199.443 miles per hour. Think about that for a second. In 1969, before computers were in cars, before modern tire compounds, he was a fraction of a percent away from 200 miles per hour in a car you could technically buy at a dealership. The race itself was a bit of a mess because of a driver boycott over tire safety, but Richard Brickhouse ended up taking the win in a Daytona. But the real headline came a few months later during a closed-course test. Buddy Baker, a legend of the sport, climbed into the number 88 Chrysler engineering car. On March 24, 1970, he did the unthinkable. He clocked a lap at 200.096 miles per hour. He was the first human being to officially break the 200 miles per hour barrier in a NASCAR stock car. Here's what's crazy. Baker said afterward that it didn't even feel that fast because the car was so stable. That's the ultimate testament to the engineering. When you're going 200 miles per hour and you feel like you're cruising down the interstate, the aerodynamicists have done their job. But while Dodge was celebrating, Chrysler had a problem. Their biggest star, Richard Petty, had left them. Petty, the king, had won 27 races in 1967 alone. He was the face of Plymouth. When he saw what Dodge was doing with the Daytona, he went to Plymouth and said, "I want one of those." Plymouth told him no. They told him he had to keep racing the standard Roadrunner. Petty, being the king, didn't argue. He just walked across the street and signed with Ford. This was a massive blow. Imagine Michael Jordan leaving the Bulls to go play for the Pistons at the height of his career. Chrysler panicked. They realized they needed to lure Petty back, and the only way to do it was to give him a wing car. But they couldn't just give him a Dodge. He was a Plymouth man. So, they told the Plymouth engineers to take the Daytona's homework and copy it for the Plymouth Roadrunner. That's how the Superbird was born. Now, if you look closely, the Superbird isn't just a rebadged Daytona. The nose is slightly different, the wing is angled back more, and the air intake is moved. It was a bit more refined, but it served the same purpose: total air dominance. Petty saw the Superbird, liked what he saw, and came home. In 1970, he drove that blue number 43 Superbird to 18 wins. It was a slaughter. Between the Daytonas and the Superbirds, Chrysler was essentially holding a private track day while the rest of the field struggled to stay in the same zip code. But as the saying goes, when you win too much, the people in charge start looking for their scissors. NASCAR officials were watching these cars fly around the track, and they were getting scared. They didn't like the idea of cars hitting 200 miles per hour, and they certainly didn't like one manufacturer making the rest of the field look like they were standing still. The Aero wars were about to hit a brick wall of regulation. The secret internal war between the 426 Hemi and the Air itself. Look, when we talk about muscle cars, the conversation almost always starts and ends with the engine. People want to know about displacement, compression ratios, and torque curve. And don't get me wrong, the 426 Hemi was an absolute titan. It was nicknamed the Elephant for a reason. It was huge, heavy, and possessed a level of brute strength that could physically twist the frame of a lesser car. But here's what most people don't realize. By 1969, Chrysler had reached a point of diminishing returns with raw horsepower. On the long straights of Daytona and Talladega, the engine was fighting a battle it couldn't win alone. Think of it this way, at 60 miles per hour, air is your friend. It keeps the radiator cool and flows gently over the glass. But at 200 miles per hour, air stops acting like a gas and starts acting like a solid. It becomes thick, heavy, and incredibly stubborn. Imagine trying to run through a waist-deep swimming pool. Now imagine trying to sprint through a pool filled with cold molasses. That's what the air feels like to a car at triple-digit speed. You can throw another 100 horsepower at the problem, but at that velocity, the air just pushes back harder. It's an exponential curve of resistance. Now, you might be thinking, just build a bigger engine, right? Well, Chrysler already had the Hemi, which was pushing out well over 500 horsepower in race trim. But the standard Dodge Charger body was essentially a giant, flat-faced brick. It was literally pushing a wall of air in front of it. This created a massive high-pressure zone at the grille and a vacuum-like low-pressure zone at the rear. This pressure differential is what creates drag. The engine was working so hard just to move that wall of air out of the way that there was nothing left for actual acceleration. This is where it gets really interesting. The engineers realized that if they could just make the car 10% more slippery, it would be more effective than adding another 100 horsepower. The nose cone was the first strike in this war. It wasn't just a piece of fiberglass for show, it was an 18-inch aerodynamic wedge. By extending the nose and tapering it to a point, they allowed the air to split and move around the car rather than slamming into it. But here is a specific, eye-opening statistic. That nose cone alone, combined with the flush-mounted front grille, reduced the car's drag coefficient so much that it effectively gained the equivalent of 50 to 70 horsepower without anyone ever touching the engine. That is the power of aerodynamic. It's free speed. But the front was only half the story. Look, the standard Charger had a recessed rear window, the tunnel look that muscle car fans love. On the street, it looks mean. At 190 miles per hour, it's a disaster. Air would roll over the roof and fall into that recessed area, creating a swirling vortex of turbulence that acted like a literal anchor pulling the car backward. To fix this, the Daytona and Superbird were fitted with a flush rear window. They basically laid a piece of glass over the tunnels to make the transition from the roof to the trunk as smooth as a slide. This kept the air attached to the body, moving it toward the wing where it could actually be useful. Now, let's talk about the reality of building these things. NASCAR has a rule called homologation. Basically, it means that if you want to race a car, you have to sell a certain number of them to the public. They didn't want companies building one-off spaceships that had no relation to what you could buy in a showroom. In 1969, the rule was that you had to build 500 units. Dodge hit that number by the skin of their teeth with 503 Daytonas. But by 1970, NASCAR upped the ante. They changed the rule to say you had to build one car for every 2 dealerships in the country. For Plymouth, that meant they had to build nearly 2,000 Superbird. Here's the thing that most people don't realize about the street versions. They were kind of a nightmare for the average person. Imagine it's 1970, and you're a suburban dad looking for a cool new car. You walk into a Plymouth dealership and see a Superbird. It's almost 18 feet long. It has a nose that sticks out so far you can't see where the car ends, making it impossible to park. It has a wing that's taller than the roof. And it's painted plum crazy purple or vitamin C orange. It looked like a cartoon. Reliable historical data shows that many of these cars sat on dealer lots for years. Some dealers were so desperate to get rid of them that they actually took the wings off and replaced the nose cones with standard Road Runner parts just to make them look normal enough to sell. Can you imagine? Taking a car that today is worth $300,000 or more and stripping its most valuable parts just to move it off the lot for $4,000. It's a relatable analogy to the tech world. It was like trying to sell a top-tier racing drone to someone who just wanted a paper airplane. The public wasn't ready for the future. And then there was the heat. The nose cone was so efficient at diverting air around the car that it actually diverted air away from the radiator. In stop-and-go traffic, the street Daytonas and Superbirds would overheat in minutes because they weren't getting the airflow they needed. They were designed to breathe at 150 miles per hour, not at a red light in downtown Detroit. This was a car that literally hated being slow. It was physically uncomfortable at low speed. But on the track? On the track, the contrast was staggering. The Hemi was finally free. With the air being managed by the nose and the wing, the engine could finally spend its energy on forward momentum instead of fighting the atmosphere. When Buddy Baker hit 200 miles per hour, the engine wasn't even at its absolute limit. The car was just cutting through the world with surgical precision. It was the moment the muscle car era evolved into the engineering era. But this level of dominance created a new problem. NASCAR is a business built on parity. They want paint-swapping action and close finishes. They don't want one car to be so much better that the race is over by lap 50. The fans might love the spectacle of a 200 miles per hour lap, but the other manufacturers, specifically Ford and Chevrolet, were complaining. They were spending millions just to try and keep up with a car that looked like a UFO. The political pressure was mounting. NASCAR President Bill France Sr. saw the writing on the wall. If he didn't stop the Aero cars, the sport would become an arms race that nobody could afford. He had to kill the winged warriors to save the sport, but the way he did it was clever and brutal. The rulebook that became a guillotine. Look, in the world of professional sports, there's a very fine line between innovation and unfair advantage. When Dodge and Plymouth showed up with these winged monsters, they weren't just playing the game. They had essentially rewritten the physics of the sport. NASCAR, at its heart, was built on the idea of stock cars, the kind of machine you could recognize from the local dealership. But by 1970, the Daytona and the Superbird looked less like Dodge Chargers and more like something designed by NASA. Here's the thing. Bill France Sr., the founder of NASCAR, was a businessman first. He knew that if the races became too predictable, if the winged cars just ran away with every trophy, the fans would stop buying tickets. And if the fans stopped buying tickets, the manufacturers would stop spending money. Now, you might be thinking, why didn't Ford and Chevy just build their own wings? Well, they tried. Ford was working on the Torino King Cobra, a car with a sloping, aerodynamic nose that looked remarkably similar to the Superbird. But here's what most people don't realize. The cost of development was skyrocketing. This was the Aero war, and it was getting expensive. Every time one manufacturer gained a tenth of a second in the wind tunnel, the others had to spend millions to catch up. It was a race to the bottom of the wallet. NASCAR decided that the only way to save the sport from itself was to pull the plug on the specialized bodywork. This is where it gets really interesting. Instead of just saying wings are illegal, which would have looked like a direct attack on Chrysler, NASCAR used the rulebook like a surgical knife. For the 1971 season, they introduced a new engine displacement rule that was specifically designed to kill the Aero cars without technically banning them. The rule stated that any car with special aerodynamic features, meaning a nose cone or a wing higher than a few inches, could only run an engine with a maximum displacement of 305 cubic inches. Let me put that into perspective for you. The 426 Hemi was a 7.0-liter monster. The 305 was a 5.0-liter small block. In terms of pure power, you were asking these teams to drop from over 500 horsepower down to maybe 300, while still carrying all the weight of the wing and the nose. It's like telling an Olympic sprinter they can keep their high-tech track spikes, but they have to run the race while wearing a 50-pound backpack. It was a death sentence. A 305 cubic inch engine in a 4,000-pound car at Daytona would have been an embarrassment. The teams knew it, the engineers knew it, and Chrysler knew it. Look, the contrast was brutal. In 1970, the Superbird was the king of the track. By 1971, it was a museum piece. Chrysler had a choice. They could try to develop a high-revving 305 to compete, or they could go back to standard, flat-faced bodies with the big Hemi. They chose the latter. The Aero cars were effectively retired overnight. It was one of the shortest and most dominant reigns in the history of any sport. One season of total glory and then silence. But while the racing story ended there, the street story was just getting weird. As I mentioned before, the street versions of these cars were orphans on the dealership lot. But here is a specific, eye-opening statistic. Out of the 1,920 Superbirds built for the 1970 model year, it is estimated that nearly 20% of them were modified by the dealers themselves just to make them sellable. Think about that. Dealers were taking brand-new, factory-built supercars and cutting them up. They would pull the nose cones off and put on standard front clip. They would remove the wings and fill the holes in the quarter panels. In some cases, they even repainted them in more conservative colors like beige or tan. Now, you might be thinking, how could they be so short-sighted? But you have to look at it through the lens of 1971. The oil crisis was looming. Insurance rates for muscle cars were through the roof. Sometimes the insurance premium for a year was 25% of the car's total value. And let's be honest, the Superbird was objectively ridiculous looking for someone just trying to drive to the grocery store. It was the ultimate, relatable analogy for being too far ahead of your time. It was the Concorde of the suburbs. Fast, impressive, and completely impractical for the world it lived in. Here's what most people don't realize about the surviving dealer-converted cars. Today, they are some of the most sought-after Easter eggs in the collector world. Finding a Roadrunner that has the reinforced structural points for a Superbird wing but was sold as a standard car is like finding a hidden treasure map. It tells the story of a time when the industry was moving so fast that the public literally couldn't keep up. The engineers at Chrysler weren't just sad, they were frustrated. Larry Rathgeb and his team had proven that aerodynamics was the future. They had broken the 200 miles per hour barrier. They had shown that a car could be designed as a total system rather than just an engine with 4 wheels attached. To have all of that work erased by a single paragraph in a rulebook was a bitter pill to swallow. But that's the nature of competitive racing. If you're too good, you're the problem. This period marked the end of the win on Sunday, sell on Monday era in its purest form. After the Aero cars were banned, NASCAR began to move toward a more template-based approach where all the cars had to fit within certain shape. The days of a manufacturer showing up with a wild, radical body shape were over. The Daytona and the Superbird were the final, soaring high note of a decade of unrestricted excess. They were the peak of the mountain before the descent into the smog-controlled, low-horsepower 1970s. Look, we often talk about these cars as investments now, but for the guys who built them, they were weapons. And like any weapon, once it becomes too effective, the authorities have to step in. The guillotine didn't just fall on the wing. It fell on the idea that engineering could be the primary driver of the sport. From 1971 onward, the driver and the pit crew became the focus again. But for that 1 year, 1970, the car was the undisputed star of the show. And that star burned so brightly that we're still talking about it 50 years later. The $1 million mistake and the rebirth of the Winged Warriors. Look, if you had a time machine and could travel back to 1972, you wouldn't be looking for gold or stocks. You'd be looking for a dusty, oversized Plymouth sitting in the back of a lot in rural Alabama. Back then, the Superbird was widely considered a mistake. It was an expensive, weird-looking leftover from a racing era that the public was trying to forget. Here's the thing. In the early 70s, these cars were the ultimate white elephant. People were trading them in for economical hatchbacks or more sensible luxury coupe. There are documented stories of Hemi Superbirds, cars that today would easily fetch $500,000, being sold for less than $2,000 just to clear space. That is a 25,000% increase in value over 50 years. If that isn't an eye-opening statistic, I don't know what is. Now, you might be thinking, surely people knew they were special even then? Honestly? No. Most people saw them as yesterday's news. Once NASCAR banned the wing, the car lost its cultural why. Without the Sunday wins to back up the Tuesday showroom presence, the Superbird just looked like a road runner with a shopping cart handle on the back. This is where it gets really interesting. The very thing that made them ugly to the general public in 1971 is exactly what makes them priceless today. We call this the Van Gogh effect. Just like the painter who couldn't sell a single canvas while he was alive, the Winged Warriors had to die as a production model before they could be reborn as icons. Here's what most people don't realize about the collector market for these cars. It's not just about the wing. It's about the survivor math. Because so many of these cars were modified, crashed, or stripped by dealers who wanted to make them look normal, the number of true factory original Daytonas and Superbirds is shockingly small. Out of the 503 Daytonas built, historians estimate that only about 385 still exist in any recognizable form. When you consider how many of those have been restored with non-original parts, the pool of pure, unadulterated engineering samples is tiny. You're looking at a survival rate of roughly 75%, which might sound high, but compare that to the standard 1969 Charger, where hundreds of thousands were made. The rarity isn't just a number, it's a bottleneck that drives the price into the stratosphere. Look, let's address an objection I hear all the time. People say, the wing is just for show on the street. It doesn't actually do anything until you hit 150 miles per hour. Now, you might be thinking that's a fair point, but let's look at the actual fluid dynamic. Even at highway speeds, say 70 or 80 miles per hour, that wing is generating measurable downforce. It's not enough to keep you from spinning out on a patch of ice, but it's there. The problem is that the street suspension wasn't tuned for it. Here's a relatable analogy. It's like putting a professional-grade racing spoiler on a minivan. The spoiler is doing its job, but the van's springs are too soft to care. On the street, the wing was mostly a conversation starter, but it was a conversation that usually started with, "Why on earth did you buy that thing?" This is where the story takes a turn toward the modern era. For decades, the Daytona and Superbird were just museum pieces, relics of a time when Detroit went too far. But recently, we've seen a rebirth of interest in Aero engineering. Look at modern hypercars like the McLaren Senna or the latest Porsche GT3 RS. What do they have? Massive, high-mounted wings. Active aerodynamic. pointed noses designed to split the air. Here's the thing. The engineers at Dodge weren't crazy in 1969, they were just 50 years early. They were using slide rules and clay models to discover the same truths that modern supercomputers are confirming today. Clean air is king. Turbulence is the enemy. I think the most surprising insight is how these cars changed the way we think about cool. In the 60s, cool meant chrome, leather, and a big V8. After the Daytona, cool started to mean functional. Even if the function was overkill for the street, the idea that a car's shape was dictated by the wind rather than a stylist's pen changed the DNA of performance cars forever. This is where it gets really interesting. The next-gen NASCAR cars of today use a rear spoiler that is actually a direct evolution of the data gathered by Rathgeb's team. They finally admitted that the winged Aero was the most aerodynamically efficient the sport had ever been. Now look, I have to be honest with you. Driving a Superbird today is an experience in pure anxiety. Imagine driving a $1 million piece of glass that's 18 feet long and has a turning radius of a school bus. You can't see the front of the car because of the nose cone. You can't see out the back because of the wing. And every time you stop for gas, you're surrounded by 20 people asking the same 3 questions. It's a relatable analogy to owning a pet dinosaur. It's the coolest thing in the neighborhood, but finding a place to park it and keeping it fed is a full-time job. But that's the price of history. The rebirth of the winged warriors isn't just about the auction prices. It's about the recognition that for one brief, shining moment, the accountants and the marketing teams lost the battle. The engineers won. They built something that wasn't supposed to exist. They built a car that was so good at its job that the governing body had to change the laws of physics, or at least the laws of the sport, to stop it. That kind of forbidden technology has a pull on the human imagination that a standard muscle car just can't match. Here's what most people don't realize. The Dodge Daytona wasn't just a car, it was a middle finger to the status quo. It was Chrysler saying, "We don't care if it looks weird. We don't care if you don't like it. We're going to win." And they did. They won so hard that they got banned. And in the world of racing, there is no higher compliment than being told your car is too fast to be legal. That is the legacy of the wing. It's a monument to the idea that if you push the boundaries far enough, you'll eventually find the place where the rules end and the legends begin. The final 971 words on why the winged warriors will never happen again. Look, we live in an era of incremental gains. Whether it's your smartphone getting a slightly faster processor or a modern car getting 2% better fuel economy, the days of the quantum leap are largely behind us. The Dodge Daytona was a quantum leap. Here's the thing, it will never happen again. Not because we lack the talent, but because the world has become too sensible, too regulated, and way too focused on the bottom line. In 1969, Chrysler was playing a high-stakes game of poker with the physics of the universe. Today, the rulebook is written in a language that doesn't allow for poets or rebels. Now, you might be thinking, with all our modern computer simulations, we could build a car that makes the Superbird look like a tricycle. And look, you're technically right. We could. But here is the eye-opening statistic. To bring a completely new vehicle architecture to market today, one that involves radical body changes like a nose cone and a massive wing, costs an average of $2.5 billion in research, development, and safety certification. In 1969, Larry Rathgeb and his team did the entire Daytona program on a shoestring budget by modern standard. They were moving at the speed of thought, not the speed of committee meetings. They didn't have to answer to a board of directors worried about pedestrian safety ratings or drag-induced fuel penalties. They just had to answer to the stopwatch. Here's what most people don't realize. The biggest obstacle to a modern winged warrior isn't NASCAR, it's the government. That 18-inch nose cone? It's a pedestrian's worst nightmare. Modern safety standards for pedestrian impact protection dictate exactly how much a hood must give when it hits a person. A pointed fiberglass wedge would never clear a modern safety audit in any country on Earth. It's essentially a 200 miles per hour spear. Look, we've traded the wild, dangerous edges of engineering for a world that is safer, but undeniably flatter. We want cars that protect us from our own mistakes, whereas the Daytona was a car that demanded you be perfect just to survive the first turn at Talladega. This is where it gets really interesting. The concept of parity has become the holy grail of modern racing. NASCAR today uses sealed engines and strictly controlled body template. If a team finds a way to be even 1% faster than the field through a clever aerodynamic trick, the organizers immediately take those parts to a wind tunnel and balance the performance. They want a show where 40 cars are separated by half a second. Chrysler didn't want a show, they wanted a funeral for Ford's racing program. That kind of total victory mindset is essentially banned in modern sports business. It's no longer about who can build the best machine. It's about who can operate most efficiently within a very small box. Think of it through this relatable analogy. The 1969 Aero wars were like the Wild West. You could carry whatever weapon you could build, and the fastest draw won the town. Modern racing is like a highly regulated shooting gallery at a county fair. Everyone has the same equipment, the same lanes, and the same targets. It's a test of skill, sure, but the outlaw spirit of building a better gun is gone. When you take away the ability to innovate on the frame and the body, you take away the mad scientist element that made the 60s so electric. Here's what most people don't realize about the men like Larry Rathgeb. They weren't just employees. They were true believers. When they stayed late in the wind tunnel, they weren't doing it for a performance bonus or a LinkedIn shout-out. They were doing it because they had found a loophole in the atmosphere. They were seeing things that no one else saw. That kind of singular, obsessive focus is rare in a corporate world defined by key performance indicators and brand alignment. The Daytona was the result of a few guys in a basement being told, "Do whatever it takes to win." Those are the most dangerous and productive 6 words in the history of engineering. Now look, some critics will say that the Winged Warriors were cheating the spirit of stock car racing. But here's my objection to that. Every great innovation in human history was cheating until it became the standard. The steam engine cheated the horse. The airplane cheated the boat. The Daytona just cheated the air. It was a car that refused to accept the limitations of its environment. It didn't just participate in the race. It redefined what a race could be. It pushed the human body and the mechanical components to a breaking point that we are still studying today. When we look at a Superbird today, we aren't just looking at a car. We're looking at a time capsule of human audacity. It's a physical manifestation of the idea that impossible is just a word for people who haven't spent enough time thinking about airflow. If you ever have the chance to stand next to one, don't just look at the wing. Look at the nose. Look at the flush window. Look at the tiny details that the engineers sweated over at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in Detroit. Those details are the fingerprints of geniuses who were given a dream and a deadline. The wing is a tombstone for a certain type of freedom. It marks the spot where engineering stopped being a secret and started being a regulated utility. But as long as these cars exist, as long as someone is willing to turn the key on a 426 Hemi and listen to that elephant roar, the spirit of the 1969 season lives on. It's a reminder that sometimes the crazy idea is the only one worth having. We need more wings. We need more pointed noses. We need more people willing to get banned for being too fast. Because at the end of the day, nobody remembers the cars that followed the rules. We only remember the ones that flew.